When a millionaire stops to help a young woman stranded on the roadside, a simple act of kindness unfolds into a journey of self-discovery. Their conversation uncovers uncanny similarities, hinting at a shared past that neither could have anticipated. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. James Carter's Bentley Continental glided smoothly along the empty highway, its metallic black finish reflecting the late afternoon sun. The road stretched ahead, cutting through the Nevada desert like a gray ribbon. Inside the climate-controlled cabin, James checked his Rolex, 4:30 p.m. The board meeting had run longer than expected, but at least the acquisition was finalized. His attention shifted to a stopped car ahead, a beat-up Honda Civic with its hood up, steam rising from the engine. A young woman in business attire stood beside it, phone in hand, frustration evident in her posture. James typically didn't stop for strangers, but something made him slow down. Maybe it was the woman's professional appearance, or perhaps the fact that cell service was notoriously poor on this stretch of road. He pulled over 50 feet ahead of the Honda, gravel crunching under the Bentley's tires. Through his rearview mirror, he observed the woman's cautious expression. Smart girl, he thought. In today's world, you couldn't be too careful. Need any help? James called out as he approached, maintaining a respectful distance. The woman, mid-20s, African-American, wearing a navy business suit that had seen better days, looked up from her phone. "The engine's overheated," she replied, gesturing to the steam. "And I can't get a signal out here." James introduced himself with a quick handshake. The woman's grip was firm, professional. "Naomi Johnson," she said. "I was heading to Las Vegas for a job interview. Guess that's not happening now." James examined the engine. The coolant reservoir was empty, a common issue in desert conditions. He retrieved a gallon of water from his car, another habit from years of desert driving. "Let's give it 15 minutes to cool down, then add this. Should get you to the next town at least." While they waited, they talked. Naomi worked as a marketing coordinator in Phoenix, but was interviewing for a senior position in Las Vegas. "It's a big step up," she explained. "Would have doubled my salary. Though I suppose showing up late isn't the best first impression." "Which company?" James asked, his interest piqued. He had connections throughout the Vegas business community. "Carter Enterprises, actually." Naomi laughed at the coincidence. "Different Carter, though, I assume." James felt an odd tightening in his chest, but maintained his neutral expression. "Actually, that's my company. The position must be in our digital marketing department." Naomi's eyes widened. "Oh God, I'm so sorry about being late, Mr. Carter. I tried calling, but James waved off her concern. "Don't worry about it. I'll call ahead and explain the situation. Sarah Matthews is handling those interviews, correct?" After adding the water and ensuring the engine was running properly, they prepared to part ways. Naomi hesitated before getting back in her car. "Thank you, Mr. Carter, not just for the help, but for being so kind about the interview. You know, I never knew my father, but I always imagined he'd be someone like you, successful but still willing to help others." The words hit James with unexpected force. He watched Naomi drive away, her taillights disappearing into the desert haze. Something about her struck him as familiar. Her mannerisms, perhaps, or the determined set of her jaw. He dismissed the thought. In his position, he'd helped countless young professionals over the years. But as he drove home, Naomi's words about her absent father echoed in his mind. They stirred memories he'd locked away decades ago, of a relationship that ended abruptly, of unanswered questions and regrets. He pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on the road ahead. Yet something had changed during that brief encounter, though he couldn't quite name it. A door had opened that wouldn't easily close again. James pulled into the circular driveway of his Henderson estate, the security gate sliding shut behind him. The Mediterranean-style mansion, with its perfectly manicured lawns and dramatic fountain, represented everything he'd achieved. Yet today it felt oddly hollow. Claire's Mercedes was parked in its usual spot. His wife of 15 years maintained a rigid schedule, and at 6:30 p.m., she'd be having her pre-dinner martini in the solarium. James found her there, surrounded by the desert sunset streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. "You're late," Claire said, not looking up from her iPad. Her blonde hair caught the fading light, and her fashion model posture remained perfect even in repose. The Hendersons called. They're expecting confirmation about the charity gala next month. James loosened his tie. I stopped to help someone with car trouble. Young woman heading to an interview at the company, actually. He poured himself a scotch, noting how Claire's perfectly manicured fingers tightened slightly on her glass. Really, James? That's what roadside assistance is for. Your position requires certain boundaries. Claire's tone carried the familiar edge of social consciousness that had become more pronounced over the years. Later that night, unable to sleep, James sat in his home office. The encounter with Naomi kept replaying in his mind. He opened his laptop and typed her name into social media. It took several attempts before he found her profile. Naomi Johnson, marketing coordinator at Phoenix Digital Solutions. His cursor hovered over her profile picture. The resemblance hit him like a physical blow. Naomi had the same smile as her mother, Sandra, a woman he hadn't allowed himself to think about in 25 years. James clicked through Naomi's photos with increasing urgency. There she was at college graduation, arm around a middle-aged woman who wasn't Sandra. Another photo showed her at a community center, volunteering. Each image revealed a life he knew nothing about, a life that should have included him. The timestamps on the photos showed her growing up in Tucson's working-class East Side. While he'd been building his empire in Las Vegas, she'd been just a few hours away, working part-time jobs through college, earning scholarships, fighting for every opportunity. He found himself doing the math. Naomi appeared to be 24 or 25. The timing aligned perfectly with his relationship with Sandra. They'd been young, ambitious. He was starting his first company. She was in law school. When she disappeared without explanation, he'd thrown himself into his work, never knowing she was pregnant. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Claire stood in the doorway, wearing her silk robe like armor. "Coming to bed?" "Soon," James replied, closing the laptop. But they both knew it was a lie. Sleep wouldn't come easily tonight, not with the weight of this discovery pressing down on him. Claire lingered in the doorway. "I know that look, James. Whatever you're thinking about doing, don't. We have a good life here, a reputation to maintain." James said nothing, but his mind was already racing ahead. The interview tomorrow. He could ensure Naomi got the position, find a way to get to know her properly. But would that be enough? And what right did he have to disrupt her life now, after all these years? The desert wind rattled the windows, carrying with it the scent of sage and possibility. In his pocket, James's phone held Naomi's contact information from her job application. One call could change everything. The question was, did he have the courage to make it? The next morning, James arrived at Cornerstone Cafe an hour before the agreed time. He'd called Naomi under the NSE of discussing her job application, suggesting they meet in this quiet establishment away from the corporate atmosphere. The cafe, with its exposed brick walls and hushed conversations, felt neutral enough for what might unfold. He chose a table in the back, positioning himself to see the entrance. Each time the door chimed, his heart rate spiked. James Carter, who routinely negotiated billion-dollar deals, found his hands unusually unsteady as he adjusted his coffee cup. Naomi arrived precisely on time, wearing a different business suit, charcoal gray, clearly chosen to impress. "Mr. Carter," she said, extending her hand. "I can't thank you enough for this opportunity." "Please call me James," he replied, noting how she organized her portfolio and notebook with methodical precision, just like Sandra used to do. "I've reviewed your application materials. Very impressive work history for someone your age." "Had to be," Naomi said, a hint of steel entering her voice. "Nobody was going to hand me anything. My adoptive mom taught me that early on." James's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. "Adoptive mom?" Naomi's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "Yes, my birth mother gave me up when I was 3. Angela, my adoptive mom, she's been everything to me." But she paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. "Sometimes I wonder about my biological parents, especially my father. Mom says he never knew about me." The words hung in the air between them. James set his cup down carefully, fighting to maintain his composure. "Tell me about your mother, your birth mother." "Sandra Mitchell, Naomi said. "She was a law student when she had me. That's all I know. She left me with a note saying she couldn't provide the life I deserved." Her fingers traced patterns on the wooden table. "I used to imagine elaborate stories about my father, that he was someone important, someone who would have wanted me if he'd known." James felt the room tilt slightly. Sandra Mitchell, the name he'd tried so hard to forget, now spoken aloud by the daughter he never knew he had. His throat tightened. Sandra, she was studying at UCLA Law School? Naomi's head snapped up. "How did you?" "I knew her," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were together for almost 2 years, until she disappeared. I never knew why, never knew about." He couldn't finish the sentence. The color drained from Naomi's face. Her hand gripped the edge of the table. "What are you saying?" "I think," James took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I think I'm your father, Naomi." The silence that followed was deafening. Naomi's expression cycled through disbelief, anger, confusion, and something else. Hope, perhaps? Outside, traffic moved along the street in slow waves, oblivious to the life-altering conversation happening within. "This isn't funny," Naomi finally said, her voice trembling. "If this is some kind of test for the job dash." "It's not," James interrupted. "I didn't know until I saw your photos last night. You look exactly like your mother. The timing, everything fits. I can take a DNA test if you want proof." Naomi stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I need to process this." She gathered her things with shaking hands. "This is too much. I can't." "Naomi, please." James reached for her arm but stopped himself. "I know this is overwhelming, but I want to explain, to understand, to make up for lost time if you'll let me." She paused at the edge of the table, not looking at him. 25 years, she said softly. 25 years of wondering, imagining, hoping. And now you're just here, running the company I'm interviewing for. She laughed, but it was a broken sound. "Life doesn't work like this." "Sometimes it does," James replied. "Sometimes the universe has a way of correcting its mistakes." Naomi finally met his eyes, and in that moment, James saw every question he'd ever had about his past reflect. Back at him. "I'll think about it," she said, then turned and walked away, leaving James alone with the weight of what had just happened. Through the cafe window, he watched her cross the street, her figure growing smaller until she disappeared around a corner. The truth was out now, for better or worse. There would be no going back to the carefully ordered life he'd built. And somewhere in his heart, James knew that was exactly as it should be. The revelation at the cafe sent shockwaves through both their lives. James returned to his office, but found himself unable to focus on the day's meetings. He sat at his desk, staring at the Las Vegas skyline through his floor-to-ceiling windows when his assistant buzzed. "Mrs. Carter is here to see you," she announced. Before James could respond, Claire burst through the door, her Hermes scarf trailing behind her like a battle flag. "Tell me it's not true," Claire demanded, closing the door firmly. "Tell me you haven't been meeting with some girl claiming to be your daughter." James turned from the window. "She's not claiming anything, Claire. I'm the one who told her. Naomi is my daughter with Sandra Mitchell." Claire sank into one of the leather chairs, her perfectly composed facade cracking. "Sandra Mitchell? That woman from before we met? The one who disappeared?" She pressed her fingers to her temples. "Do you have any idea what this will do to us? To our position in the community?" "Our position?" James felt a surge of anger. "My daughter grew up without a father because I didn't know she existed. And you're worried about our social standing?" "Don't be naive, James," Claire snapped. "We have shareholders to consider, board members who won't appreciate this scandal. Not to mention the charity foundation. Do you think the governor's wife will still co-chair our events with this hanging over us?" Meanwhile, across town, Naomi sat in her hotel room, staring at her phone. The screen showed a photo she'd found online, James Carter at a business awards ceremony 10 years ago. She could see traces of herself in his features. The same determined jaw, the same way of holding themselves. How had she not noticed it during their roadside encounter? A text message appeared from an unknown number. "I understand if you need space, but I'm here when you're ready to talk." "James," Naomi threw the phone onto the bed and paced the room. Her whole life had been built around the mystery of her origins. Now the answers were here, wrapped in an impossible package. A billionaire father who ran the company she'd been desperately trying to work for. The irony made her laugh until tears came. She called the one person who could help her make sense of it all, her adoptive mother, Angela. "Baby girl." Angela's warm voice came through the speaker. "What's wrong? How did the interview go?" "Mom," Naomi's voice cracked. "I found him. My father. He found me, actually." The words tumbled out as she explained everything. Back in his office, James faced down Claire's increasingly hostile reactions. "I won't hide this," he stated firmly. "Naomi is my daughter. If the board has concerns, they can take it up with me directly." "And what about me?" Claire's voice rose. "Did you consider how this affects my life? I've spent 15 years building our reputation, making us a power couple in this city. Now you want to throw that away for some girl you just met?" "That girl is my flesh and blood," James replied, his tone dangerous. "And I've already missed 25 years of her life. I won't miss any more because of social appearances." Claire stood, smoothing her designer dress. "You're making a mistake, James. One that could cost us everything we've built." "No," James said quietly. "The mistake was letting people like you convince me that image matters more than substance. Naomi is real. She's my daughter. And if you can't accept that, then maybe we need to reevaluate more than just our social calendar." As Claire stormed out, James's phone buzzed with a message from Naomi. "I have questions. A lot of them. Can we meet again?" James felt his heart lift. It was a small opening, but it was something. He quickly typed back, "Name the time and place. I'll be there." In her hotel room, Naomi read the response. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was clear. She had spent her whole life wondering about her father, imagining countless scenarios. Now that reality had exceeded even her wildest imaginings, she faced a choice: embrace this new truth with all its complications, or retreat to the safety of what she knew. The sun was setting over Las Vegas, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. In different parts of the city, father and daughter stared out at the same horizon, both knowing that tomorrow would bring them one step closer to bridging the gap of 25 years. The following week, James and Naomi embarked on an impromptu road trip through the American Southwest. James had suggested it as a way to talk without the pressures of Las Vegas looming over them. They took his Range Rover, leaving behind the pretense of corporate meetings and formal interactions. Their first stop was Tucson, where Naomi had grown up. She directed him through the working-class neighborhoods, past the small house where she'd spent her childhood. "Angela worked 2 jobs to keep us here," Naomi explained, pointing to a modest ranch-style home with desert landscaping. "She wanted me in a good school district." James gripped the steering wheel tighter, imagining his daughter's life unfolding in these streets while he'd been living in luxury just a few hours away. "Tell me about growing up here," he said, keeping his voice steady. "It wasn't always easy," Naomi admitted. "Being adopted, being black in a predominantly white school, I had to work twice as hard to be taken seriously." She paused, watching a group of children play basketball in a driveway. There was this career day in 5th grade. Everyone's parents came to talk about their jobs. I told everyone my real dad was a successful businessman who couldn't make it because he was closing an important deal. The words hit James like physical blows. "I would have been there," he said softly, "if I'd known." They stopped at a small Mexican restaurant where Naomi had worked through high school. The owner, Maria, recognized her immediately. "Naomi, mi estrella." The older woman embraced her, then looked curiously at James. "This is my father," Naomi said, the words still strange on her tongue. Maria's eyes widened, but she quickly recovered, ushering them to a quiet booth in the back. Over plates of enchiladas, Maria shared stories about teenage Naomi's determination. She would study between orders, never complained about extra shifts. Such drive in someone so young. Their journey continued through Arizona, stopping at places that had shaped Naomi's life. The community center where she'd volunteered, teaching computer skills to elderly residents. The library where she'd spent countless hours preparing for SATs. Each location revealed another layer of the remarkable woman she'd become. At a rest stop near Phoenix, Naomi finally asked the question that had been burning inside her. Did you ever think about her? My mother? James stared out at the desert landscape. Every day for years, he admitted. Sandra was brilliant, determined. We met at a business seminar. I was just starting my first company, and she was in law school. When she disappeared, he shook his head. I hired private investigators, but she'd vanished completely. I never knew she was pregnant. She left me this. Naomi pulled out a worn envelope from her bag. I've never shown anyone else. Inside was a brief letter, explaining that Sandra had wanted to give her daughter a better life than she could provide. She never mentioned you. James read the letter, his hands trembling slightly. Sandra's familiar handwriting brought back a flood of memories. She was protecting you, he realized. My first company was failing then. I was working 20-hour days, barely staying afloat. She must have thought that a clean break was better, Naomi finished. But was it? All these years of wondering, imagining. Their conversation was interrupted by James's phone ringing, Claire again. He declined the call his fifth time today. My wife, he explained. She's having trouble accepting this situation. I'm disrupting your life, Naomi said, looking away. Maybe this wasn't a good idea. No, James said firmly. You're not disrupting my life. You're completing it. I've achieved everything I thought I wanted. Wealth, success, status. But sitting here learning about your life, who you've become, this means more than all of it. As they drove on, the desert sun setting behind them, both father and daughter felt the weight of lost years. But with each mile, each shared story, they were building something new, a bridge across the chasm of time that had separated them. The Carter Mansion's grand ballroom buzzed with Las Vegas's elite during the annual Children's Hospital Foundation Gala. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over guests in designer evening wear, while waiters circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. James had insisted Naomi attend, despite Claire's vocal objections. Naomi stood near a marble column, feeling out of place in a borrowed designer gown. She observed Claire holding court across the room, carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of her presence. The whispers had already started, speculation about the mysterious young woman who'd appeared in James Carter's life. Don't let them intimidate you, James said, appearing beside her with 2 glasses of champagne. Half these people were nobodies before they made their money. At least you've earned everything you've achieved. A board member's wife approached them, curiosity barely masked by social grace. James, aren't you going to introduce us to your guest? James straightened, his voice clear and firm. Margaret, this is my daughter, Naomi Johnson. Naomi, Margaret Whitmore chairs our hospital's pediatric wing. The woman's perfectly maintained smile faltered for a moment. Daughter? I wasn't aware. Few people were, James replied coolly. Including me, until recently. But we're making up for lost time. Across the room, Claire watched the interaction with growing anger. She cornered James by the bar later, her voice a harsh whisper. This is inappropriate, James. The board members are talking. The Hendersons just canceled their investment in our new development. Let them talk, James responded. And if the Hendersons are that short-sighted, we don't need their money. You're being ridiculous, Claire hissed. This girl appears out of nowhere. And suddenly you're willing to risk everything? What proof do you even have that she's yours? The DNA test results came back yesterday, James said quietly. Not that I needed them, but since you're so concerned about proof, you can rest assured, she's my daughter. Claire's face hardened. I've scheduled a meeting with our lawyers tomorrow. If you continue down this path, you need to understand what you stand to lose. Are you threatening me, Claire? I'm protecting our interests, something you seem to have forgotten how to do. The tension was interrupted by a sudden burst of applause. Naomi had taken the stage where the charity auction was being held. Instead of shrinking under the spotlight, she commanded it, speaking passionately about her own experiences volunteering at community health clinics. Every child deserves access to quality health care, she was saying, not just those born into privilege. That's why organizations like this matter so much. The crowd was captivated. Even some of Claire's staunchest allies were nodding in approval. James felt a surge of pride watching his daughter handle herself. Why? Teach such grace and authenticity. She's good, a senior board member commented to James. Natural leadership quality. Reminds me of you when you were younger, before. He glanced at Claire, letting the sentence hang. The evening concluded with Naomi's impromptu speech helping to raise record donations. As guests departed, James overheard multiple conversations praising his daughter's poise and commitment to social causes. Claire left early, her departure noticed by all. James found Naomi on the terrace, looking out over the city lights. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know this is causing problems with your wife." "Claire's problems are her own," James replied. "She built her life around an image. Reality doesn't always fit neatly into those kinds of boxes." "Is it worth it?" Naomi asked. "All this upheaval?" James turned to face his daughter fully. "When I started in business, I thought success meant having the biggest house, the most influential friends, the perfect society wife. Tonight, watching you up there, speaking from your heart about things that matter, that's real success. That's worth any price." As they stood there, father and daughter sharing a quiet moment above the glittering city, both knew that while one chapter of their lives was ending, another was just beginning. The question was, who would stand with them when the dust settled? The community center in East Las Vegas was a far cry from the glamorous charity galas of the previous week. Paint peeled from the walls, and the air conditioning struggled against the desert heat. But here, among after-school programs and job training classes, Naomi and James found common ground. "I used to volunteer at a place like this in Tucson," Naomi explained, helping a group of teenagers with their resume writing workshop. "Sometimes all people need is someone to believe in them." James watched her interact with the students, seeing echoes of his younger self, before wealth and status had complicated everything. He'd forgotten what it felt like to help people directly, without the buffer of foundation boards and tax-deductible donations. During a break, they sat in the center's small courtyard, sharing coffee from paper cups. "Tell me about your mother," Naomi said suddenly. "Your relationship with your parents." James stared into his coffee. "My father was a gambling addict," he admitted. "He'd win big, lose bigger. My mother worked as a waitress, trying to keep us afloat. When I was 16, he disappeared with their savings. Never saw him again." "Is that why you worked so hard? To be different from him?" "Partly," James nodded. "I swore I'd never leave anyone depending on me." "Ironic, considering you didn't know about me," Naomi said softly. "That's different." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the sound of children playing basketball in the adjacent court. James cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about starting a foundation. Not the usual black-tie charity stuff, but something focused on community centers like this. Would you consider running it?" Naomi looked surprised. "Me? But I don't have experience with Dash." "You have exactly the right experience," James interrupted. "You know what these communities need because you've lived it. The rest is just paperwork and politics, things I can teach you." Their conversation was interrupted by James's phone buzzing. Another message from Claire's lawyers. He declined to call. "Your wife really hates me, doesn't she?" Naomi asked, watching his expression. "Claire hates anything that threatens her world order," James replied. "When I met her, I was desperate to belong in the upper echelons of society. She knew exactly how to make that happen. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of who I really was." "And who is that?" James smiled. "Would you believe I started my first business in a garage, rebuilding computers for local schools? Claire convinced me to sell it when we got married. Said it wasn't prestigious enough." They spent the afternoon working with the center's staff, identifying needs and brainstorming solutions. James found himself energized in a way he hadn't felt in years. Watching Naomi problem solve, seeing her natural leadership abilities emerge, he realized she had inherited not just his looks, but his original passion for making a difference. "You know," he said as they were leaving, "I've been carrying around this guilt about not being there for your childhood. But seeing the woman you've become, maybe things happened exactly as they needed to." "How do you mean?" "If I'd been your father from the beginning, you might have grown up like Claire wanted, all surface, no substance. Instead, you grew up understanding what really matters." Naomi considered this. "Maybe, but I still would have liked to have known you." "We can't change the past," James said, "but we can build something meaningful now, something that helps others while helping us heal." As they walked to their cars, a teenager from the Resume workshop ran up to Naomi. "Miss Johnson, I got the job at the tech store?" Naomi's face lit up as she hugged the girl. James watched, remembering a time when success meant more than just profit margins and stock prices. In his daughter's genuine joy at helping others, he saw a chance for his own redemption. The GPS directed them down a quiet street in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where adobe houses nestled against the backdrop of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. According to their investigation, Sandra Mitchell had been living here for the past decade, working as a legal aid attorney. James's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. After hiring a more discreet private investigator, they'd finally located Sandra. The moment felt surreal. 25 years of questions about to be answered. "We can turn back," Naomi said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you're not ready." "Are you ready?" James asked, glancing at his daughter. "No," Naomi admitted, "but I don't think I ever will be." They parked outside a modest Southwestern-style home with a well-tended garden of native plants. Wind chimes tinkled in the breeze, and a cat watched them suspiciously from a windowsill. Everything about the place spoke of simplicity and purpose, so different from the luxury Sandra had walked away from. James checked the address again, though he'd memorized it days ago. Number 1542. "This is it." They sat in silence for several minutes, both gathering courage. Finally, Naomi spoke. "I need to know why. Why she left, why she gave me up, even if the answers hurt." They approached the front door together. Before they could ring the bell, it opened. Sandra Mitchell stood there, older but still recognizable to James. Her hair had gone gray, and laugh lines creased her face, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. "I saw you pull up," she said quietly. "I've been expecting this day for a long time." The living room was filled with books and indigenous artwork. Sandra led them to a sitting area, her movements careful, measured. No one spoke for what felt like eternity. "You look just like your father," Sandra finally said to Naomi, her voice thick with emotion. "I used to see his features in you when you were a baby. It made everything harder." "Why?" The question burst from Naomi like a dam breaking. "Why did you leave us?" Sandra's hands trembled as she reached for a photo album. "I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder during law school," she began. "I managed it well with medication until I got pregnant. The drugs I needed weren't safe during pregnancy, so I had to stop." She opened the album, showing pictures of infant Naomi. "After you were born, I developed severe postpartum depression on top of the bipolar disorder. I became convinced I would hurt you, that I was toxic." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I couldn't tell James. He was already struggling with his business, working himself to exhaustion. Odd. I thought if I disappeared, you would both have a chance at better lives." James leaned forward. "You should have told me, Sandra. We could have figured something out." "Could we?" Sandra asked. "You were barely sleeping, mortgaged to the hilt, trying to prove yourself. Would you really have been able to handle a baby and a mentally ill partner?" "That should have been my choice to make," James said firmly. Sandra turned to Naomi. "I made sure you went to a good family. Angela Johnson. I researched her thoroughly before choosing her. I knew she would give you the stability I couldn't." "She did," Naomi acknowledged. "But I still needed you. Both of you." "I know," Sandra whispered. "I've lived with that guilt every day. Eventually, I got the help I needed, found the right medication combination. By then, years had passed. I convinced myself it was too late to undo what I'd done." James watched his daughter process this information, saw the complex emotions play across her face. They'd come seeking answers, but answers didn't always bring the closure one hoped for. Are you better now?" Naomi asked hesitantly. Sandra nodded. "I've been stable for many years. I work with domestic violence survivors, helping them build new lives. Every time I help a mother and child stay together, I think of you." The afternoon sun slanted through Sandra's windows as the three of them continued their conversation, 25 years of silence finally breaking. Coffee cups sat cold and forgotten on the table between them as layers of truth emerged. "I tracked your achievements from afar," Sandra admitted, pulling out newspaper clippings and printouts. "Your high school graduation, college scholarships, volunteer awards. I kept everything." Naomi's hands shook as she looked through the collection. You were watching me all this time? From a distance. I couldn't risk disrupting your life, but I needed to know you were okay. Sandra glanced at James. When you made headlines with your tech company going public, I knew Naomi would be provided for, even if indirectly. James felt a surge of anger. Provided for? She worked multiple jobs through college. She lived in a cramped apartment with 3 roommates. If I had known Dash, that's exactly why I couldn't tell you, Sandra interrupted. Your sense of responsibility would have forced you to help, even if it meant sacrificing your dreams. I couldn't bear that burden. Naomi stood abruptly, pacing the room. So everyone was making decisions about my life except me. Mom, Angela, she always said my birth parents must have had their reasons. I hated that phrase. Their reasons. As if reasons could fill the empty chair at school events or explain why I felt so different from everyone else. Sandra reached for her daughter, but stopped short. I was sick, Naomi. Not just sad or anxious, but deeply ill. The voices in my head told me you'd be better off without me. That I would destroy you like I destroyed everything else. But you got better, Naomi said, her voice cracking. You got better and still stayed away. James watched the exchange, his own emotions churning. He understood mental illness. His mother had struggled with depression after his father left. But the weight of Sandra's decisions, the years lost. I need some air, Naomi announced suddenly, heading for the door. James started to follow, but Sandra caught his arm. Let her process, she said softly. She's strong, stronger than I ever was. Once they were alone, James turned to his former love. Why didn't you reach out after you got better? Even just to tell me about her? Sandra's eyes filled with tears. Pride, shame, fear, take your pick. By then, you were married to Claire, building your empire. What right did I have to complicate your life? Every right, James said firmly. She was my daughter. Is your daughter, Sandra corrected. And she needs both of us now, however messy this situation might be. Throw. GH the window, they could see Naomi in the garden, phone to her ear, likely calling Angela, the woman who had raised her when they couldn't. The sight struck them both silent. Finally, Sandra spoke again. I've been working on forgiveness and therapy for years. Forgiving myself has been the hardest part, but seeing her now, successful, compassionate, resilient, maybe I didn't make all the wrong choices. She's amazing, James agreed, but she deserved to have all of us in her corner. Yes, Sandra nodded. She did. She does. The question is, where do we go from here? Before James could respond, Naomi returned, her eyes red, but her posture determined. I talked to Mom. Angela, she clarified. She says family isn't about the past. It's about who shows up for the future. The words hung in the air, offering a possibility none of them had dared to hope for. Not forgiveness, exactly, but perhaps understanding. Not forgetting, but moving forward. The tension in Sandra's living room was interrupted by an unexpected knock at the door. William Harrison, James's longtime friend and legal advisor, stood there, his expression grave. Sandra's face went pale at the sight of him. Bill, James said, surprised. How did you find us? I've always known where Sandra was, William replied, stepping inside. I've known for 25 years. The admission hung in the air like a thundercloud. James felt his chest tighten. What are you talking about? William looked at Sandra, who had sunk back into her chair. It's time they knew the truth, Sandra. All of it. Please, Sandra whispered. Not now. The statute of limitations has expired, William continued, addressing James. Your father's crimes can't be prosecuted anymore. James stood, his voice dangerous. My father? What does he have to do with this? William pulled out an old envelope from his briefcase. Your father didn't just disappear with gambling debts, James. He was embezzling money from drug cartels. When they discovered it, they threatened to kill you and your mother to send a message. Naomi watched as her father's face went through a cascade of emotions. Sandra, James turned to her. Did you know about this? Your father contacted me, Sandra admitted, tears streaming down her face. He said they were watching you, that they'd kill anyone close to you. When I discovered I was pregnant, she covered her face with her hands. I helped her disappear, William added. Created new identities, arranged the adoption through back channels. It was the only way to keep both of you safe. James collapsed into a chair. All these years, you let me believe she just abandoned me. Let me think my father was just a gambling addict who ran away. The threat was real, William insisted. Your father was killed 6 months later in Mexico. If they had known about Naomi's voice cut through the tension. So I wasn't given up because of mental illness. The bipolar disorder was real, Sandra said quickly. But it wasn't the only reason. I had to protect you, both of you. The cartel had a reputation for eliminating entire families. When did it become safe? James demanded. The cartel leaders were arrested 15 years ago, William replied. But by then, everyone had built new lives. Sandra was finally stable. Naomi was thriving with her adoptive family. You were successful and married. That wasn't your decision to make. James's voice shook with anger. Any of you. Naomi stood in the middle of the room, processing this final revelation. So my entire life, the adoption, the separation, everything was because of a threat from criminals? And now, a new voice said from the doorway. Claire stood there, designer handbag clutched like a shield. Now it all comes out. Claire. James stared at his wife. How? I followed William, she said. I knew he was hiding something about your past. I never imagined. She laughed bitterly. All my concerns about scandal and social standing seem rather petty now, don't they? The room fell silent as the weight of the truth settled over them all. Decades of secrets, lies, and protective measures had shaped their lives in ways none of them had imagined. Finally, Naomi spoke. So, what do we do now? Now that we know everything. James stood, looking at each person in turn. His daughter, strong and resilient. Sandra, carrying the burden of an impossible choice. William, who had protected them all in his own way. And Claire, witnessing the unraveling of everything she thought she knew. Now, James said firmly, we stop letting the past dictate our future. We build something new, something honest. He turned to Naomi, starting with that foundation we discussed. A real legacy, not built on secrets and fear, but on helping others. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows through Sandra's windows, the group began the difficult but necessary process of rebuilding their relationships on a foundation of truth. The story that began with a chance encounter on a desert highway had come full circle, revealing that sometimes the greatest threats to our happiness aren't our enemies, but the secrets we keep to protect those we love.